It was a perfect summer afternoon in 2013 when two moms, Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson, took their kids to Birch Bay water slides for an afternoon play. And those two moms were just having a casual conversation by the pool. Little did they know that would uncover a decades-old chilling mystery and send shockwaves through their small town of Acme, Washington, once again. One mother mentioned a haunting local case, the brutal murder of 18-year-old Mandy Stavik in 1989. A crime that had remained unsolved for over 2 decades. But that day, in between laughter and splashes, a single remark set off a chain of events that finally led investigators to a killer hiding in plain sight. What did they say? How did a routine outing turn into the break police had been waiting for? And who had been living among them with a dark secret all these years? Stay with me because this story is about to take a shocking turn. Hardly anyone in Acme worries about locking their doors while going out. The local diner was always buzzing, the general store had everything you needed, and people just felt safe. But that all changed on November 24, 1989. That morning, Mandy Stavik went for a run with her German Shepherd, Kira, something she'd done countless times before. But this time only the dog came back, and Mandy was nowhere to be found. Panic set in fast, and the whole town sprang into action, searching everywhere. But 3 days later, the worst possible news hit. Her body was found floating in the South Fork of the Nooksack River. The only way they could identify her? The tennis shoes and socks she was still wearing? Naturally, fear set in the town. Everybody could sense that there was a killer in their midst, and what's even more chilling, for 25 long years, there wasn't a single solid suspect. It felt like Mandy's case would never be solved. But then, out of nowhere, a casual conversation at a water park changed everything. Back in '89, Detective Ron Peterson had been the one leading the search. He remembered the moment he spotted something pink in a side channel of the river while moving upstream in his Zodiac boat. It was Mandy. She was still wearing her running shoes, but only shoes, nothing else. As he gently lifted her from the water, he whispered something to her, overcome by the weight of what had happened. Even decades after that haunting event, Acme never really moved on. Mandy's death shattered their sense of safety. Mandy wasn't just a bright student or a talented athlete. She was a force of nature, driven, full of life. She had so much ahead of her. But that Thanksgiving break in 1989 changed everything. The day after the holiday, she set out on her usual jog. Detective Kevin Bohe, who was just a rookie back then, later pieced together her final run. She left her house, jogged west along Strand Road, and was last seen passing a man in a pickup truck before heading toward a wooded bend. That's likely where it happened, so whoever took her had to be in a vehicle. She was too fast for someone to grab on foot. Investigators think a gun was used to threaten her. Witnesses later said the attacker even kicked Kira into a ditch before forcing Mandy into the car. He drove her about 3.5 miles away where he assaulted her. The scratches on her arms and legs showed she fought hard. Probably tried to escape through thick blackberry bushes. But he caught up to her, hit her, and then put her in the river to make sure she didn't survive. Ron Peterson knew how important it was to preserve any evidence on Mandy's body. He'd just trained with the FBI on DNA recovery and handled her with extreme care. That made all the difference. The autopsy later confirmed everything that they feared. There was male DNA, semen, proof of sexual assault. For years, they chased every lead. Tips flooded in. But no one stood out, at least not enough to close the case. At first, suspicion fell on a drifter named David Suchy. He was hanging around that day, so the cops got a warrant for his DNA. But guess what? No match. They kept digging, questioning people, even Mandy's boyfriend, Rick Zender. But everything led to a dead end. Desperate for answers, authorities collected DNA samples from about 30 local men. Still nothing. And that way the case just froze. Mandy's mother, Mary Stavik, never stopped hoping for justice. But as the years dragged on, hope started slipping away. Then nearly 25 years later, out of nowhere, a new suspect popped up. There was a mysterious guy who had lived in Mandy's neighborhood the whole time but was never even on the radar. Meanwhile, Detective Kevin Bohe, who actually went to school with Mandy, never let go of the case. By 2009, he was leading the investigation, digging through old files like a man on a mission. That's when he found John Wisniewski, a local drug dealer who once claimed he knew something. His DNA didn't match, but Bohe wasn't convinced. He chased Wisniewski all the way to Cambodia in 2010, only to have the guy deny everything. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. Then out of nowhere, a twist, one of those bizarre, fate-driven moments. In 2013, two moms were chatting at a water park, just catching up. Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson, both former students at Mount Baker High, had always had this unsettling feeling about one same guy. But you know, in a small town, calling someone out like that is risky. So they kept quiet until that day. That's when they finally said his name, Timothy Bass. Heather remembered an eerie moment from back in '89. She was just 15, riding in a truck with some friends after a softball game. Tim, who was already in his 20s, sat next to her, complimenting her eyes and dragging a pen along her knees. Creepy, right? She didn't say anything at the time, but the memory stuck with her. For Marilee, it was even worse. It was 1991, and she was home alone with her young son when Tim Bass knocked on her door. He said he'd been out hunting all day and needed to use the phone. Being neighborly, she let him in. The call didn't go through, but instead of leaving, he just wandered through her house, straight into her bedroom. Then came the confession. He'd been driving by her house for years. He was in love with her. He wanted to be with her. Terrified, she told him to leave, but he wouldn't. She had to threaten to call the cops before he finally backed off. Years later, when Mandy's murder was still unsolved, these encounters took on a whole new meaning. Marilee called Detective Ken Gates, another Mount Baker High grad, and told him she was sure Tim Bass had killed Mandy. And here's the chilling part. His house had been less than 2 miles from Mandy's, right on her regular running route. Back in the day, nobody had even looked at him twice, and his family was well liked, so investigators just assumed they couldn't be involved. But now, the pieces were starting to fall into place, and that right there was the moment the cold case started to heat up. For 25 years, Tim Bass lived a quiet, uneventful life. He had a wife, 3 kids, and a steady job as a bakery delivery driver. No criminal record, no run-ins with the law. Nothing that would make anyone look at him twice. He kept to himself, went to work, and came home. That was it. So when the police knocked on his door and asked him about Mandy Stavik, he acted like he barely knew the name. Hesitated for a moment, then muttered something about that girl they found in the river. And when they asked for a DNA sample, he flat out refused. Said he'd seen enough crime shows to know how that worked. DNA gets you convicted. Now, the cops weren't just going to let this slide. Since Tim wouldn't willingly give up his DNA, they started tailing him on his bakery routes, hoping he'd toss something, gum, a napkin, anything they could test. But no luck. He was too careful to do that. Then, out of nowhere, help came from an unexpected place. Tim had a younger brother, Tom, who remembered their childhood as pretty normal. Sports, games, the usual sibling rivalry. But Tim, he was different, always a bit of a loner. As he got older, it became more obvious. Social situations didn't come naturally to him. And then there was that one night in high school. After a breakup, he locked himself in his room with a gun, threatening to end it all. Eventually, he fired a shot into the air instead. But after that, something in him changed. He grew resentful, especially toward women. Tom's wife, Robin, saw it firsthand. To Tim, women weren't equals. They were beneath him. At 22, just 6 weeks after Mandy's murder, Tim got married to Gina Malone, a fellow Mount Baker graduate. But it wasn't some fairy tale romance. Gina later admitted she married him to escape her own home. What she didn't know was that she was stepping into something much worse. For nearly 3 decades, Tim controlled everything. Gina wasn't a partner, she was more like a servant. He dismissed her opinions, ordered her around, and made sure she never felt like she had a way out. When she finally tried to leave, even getting a restraining order, Tim threatened to lie in court to take the kids from her. Scared for them, she stayed. Meanwhile, investigators were trying to be sure before making a move. They tested over 3 dozen other men's DNA. No match. And Tim, of course, still refused. That's when they approached his boss, Kim Wagner, at the bakery. She wasn't surprised. She'd seen his temper, the way he talked down to women, calling her woman instead of using her name. When the cops explained what they needed, she didn't hesitate. For months, she kept a close eye on Tim, waiting for him to slip up. Every day, she checked the trash, making sure it was empty, ready for the moment he tossed something usable. And finally, after 3 long months, it happened. He threw away a plastic cup and a Coke can. Kim didn't waste a second. She grabbed them, knowing this could be it, the final piece of the puzzle that would finally expose him. Soon enough, it was in the hands of the police, but even with hard proof, doubt crept in. Could the betrayal really have come from someone so close? It was a tough pill to swallow. Months crawled by, and then finally the bombshell dropped. DNA results from the state crime lab. It was a perfect match. Armed with the DNA proof, detectives caught up with Tim Bass just as he was clocking out of work. He didn't flinch at first, denying everything. He swore he barely even knew Mandy, let alone had anything romantic with her. But when they hit him with the DNA evidence, his confidence cracked. Instead of denying, he fumbled, asking how they'd even gotten it. And then came December 12, 2017, 28 years after Mandy Stavik was murdered. Cops cornered Tim in a bakery parking lot and slapped the cuffs on him. Charges: kidnapping, rape, and murder. As they read out the charges, his only response was a clueless, "Who?" Word spread like wildfire. For Mandy's family, it was a wave of emotions: grief, shock, relief, all tangled together. Her sister Molly couldn't even process it. Detective Bohe made the call to Kim Wagner, the woman who had played a key role in retrieving the DNA. But Tim Bass stuck to his story. He was innocent. And then suddenly he had a new angle. He and Mandy had been secretly involved. It wasn't a crime, he claimed, it was consensual. The revelation flipped the case on its head. Was this the truth or just a desperate attempt to explain away the damning DNA? Meanwhile, scrutiny fell on the investigators. Had they crossed a line to get that DNA? The courtroom battle was about to begin, and for prosecutor Dave McEachran, there was one thing that mattered: justice for Mandy. McEachran was a 73-year-old, long-retired lawyer, but not done fighting. This case had haunted him since Mandy was murdered when he was 44. For him, he wasn't in it for the money, this was personal. The prosecution came in strong. The evidence was clear. Tim's DNA was found inside Mandy, a woman who had been kidnapped, raped, and murdered. What more needs to be said? But the defense wasn't backing down. Tim Bass wasn't guilty, they argued, and his lawyer, Stephen Jackson, had a different story to tell, one that turned the entire narrative on its head. According to the defense, Bass and Mandy had been seeing each other in secret. Their last encounter, just hours before she was killed. At first, Bass had barely admitted to knowing her, but when backed into a corner, his story changed. Suddenly, they had been friendly, then more than friendly. His defense team insisted that DNA only proves sex happened, not that it was forced. The prosecution wasn't buying it. They called his changing story a desperate lie, a cover-up. And then there was Kim Wagner, the woman who risked a lot to step forward and bring the DNA evidence to light. She took the stand unshaken, determined to see justice served. The defense hit back with science. Forensic expert Dr. Elizabeth Johnson explained that the semen could have been left up to 48 hours before Mandy's death, which, they argued, fit their story of a consensual relationship. But then came the prosecution's ace, Dr. Gary Goldfogel, the original medical examiner. He wasn't mincing words. The evidence, he insisted, pointed to a brutal crime: rape, murder, and a body dumped in the river soon after. So basically, 2 versions of the truth clashed in that courtroom. One was a story of undeniable violence, and the other a tragic romance gone wrong. In the end, it all came down to the jury. Their decision would finally bring an answer, one that had been nearly 3 decades in the making. The courtroom was packed, but for Tim Bass, it probably felt like the walls were closing in. One by one, familiar faces from his past took the stand, faces that had once been part of his life but now stood against him. It wasn't just a trial, it was a family reckoning, painful and raw. First up was his ex-wife, Gina. She had divorced him after his arrest, and honestly, she seemed done with him. She told the court about the day she saw Tim try to pull his mother into his mess, asking her to lie, to say his long-dead father was the one responsible. His mother, torn apart, covered her face, hesitated for a moment, and then refused. Then came Tom, Tim's own brother. You could see the struggle on his face. Testifying against family isn't easy. He recalled how Tim, already feeling the heat of the investigation, had admitted to sleeping with Mandy decades earlier. But that wasn't all. Tim then tried to drag Tom into it, asking him to tell the police that he too had been with Mandy. Now it was a desperate move, an attempt to make it seem like Mandy had been involved with multiple people. And then after Tim's arrest, his paranoia kicked in. He insisted the cops were lying, that the whole world was out to get him. He begged his mother to say they had been out Christmas shopping the day Mandy disappeared. He told Tom to help him however he could. Despite all this, the defense did what they could. They tried to argue that innocent people sometimes act suspiciously under pressure. They even suggested that maybe people had misjudged Mandy's relationship with Tim, that maybe she had been with him willingly. But the prosecution didn't waver. They made it clear. There was no love story here, no secret romance, just an abduction, a rape, and a murder. And Tim Bass was responsible. And the biggest blow to the defense, the DNA evidence, it was the nail in the coffin. No one had ever seen Tim and Mandy together, but the forensic proof was undeniable. The jury had a lot to process. They combed through maps, notes, and every detail of the case. Some jurors hesitated. What if there was even a tiny room of doubt? But after a little over a day, they had their answer. Nearly 30 years after Mandy Stavik's life was stolen, the verdict was read. Guilty, murder, rape, kidnapping. The room felt heavy as the reality of it sank in. Mandy's family broke down, hugging each other, overwhelmed by the moment. Decades of waiting, and finally, justice. Tim Bass would never walk free again. Tim's mother, though, still stood by her son. And then, for the first time since his arrest, Tim himself spoke. He claimed he was innocent, that the trial wasn't fair, but in the end he said nothing more. Because, whether he liked it or not, this day didn't belong to him. It belonged to the Stavik family. Tim Bass finally got what was coming to him. Nearly 27 years behind bars. The judge didn't hold back, giving him the maximum sentence possible. But you know what? He actually dodged an even harsher fate. Prosecutors weren't fully convinced they could prove premeditated murder, so they didn't push for it. That little technicality saved him from spending the rest of his life locked up. For 30 long years, he walked around free, living like nothing had happened. Even with the conviction, Tim kept up his act, swearing he was innocent. But his brother Tom, he never bought it. He'd always known the truth, and for him, this sentence was way overdue. But Tom couldn't shake a chilling thought. Had there been other victims? Could Heather or Marilee have been next? That idea haunted him. But those two women, they weren't living in fear anymore. They had helped bring him down, and they knew it. With Tim Bass behind bars, there was a sense of safety again, like the town could finally start healing. But do you still think maybe Tim was a pervert, but for this case in particular, what if Tim was innocent? What if they were having a secret affair? Is it possible a woman like Mandy Stavik would fall for Tim? What are the chances for this to be true? It's a debatable point, and you can share your view in the comments below. But beyond this case, something bigger was happening in Vero Beach. A 26-year-old Diana Duve left her boyfriend's apartment and suddenly vanished into thin air. What began as a quiet night in Vero Beach became a chilling mystery. A young woman gone in an instant. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered dark secrets no one saw coming. What really happened to Diana Duve, and who was hiding the truth? Watch this next video to know the truth. Subscribe to this channel for more true crime content. See you soon.